May 8, 1945, the day the guns finally fell silent. The air over Germany still reeked of smoke and gunpowder, a ghost of war that refused to fade. The fighting had stopped, but the world had not yet remembered how to breathe. Streets that once thundered with marching boots now lay buried beneath rubble and snow, the sound of victory swallowed by the weight of ruin. Munich, 1945. The city was a skeleton of what it once was. Walls cracked open, air thick with smoke, and silence broken only by the slow crunch of boots on rubble. Inside one of those shattered buildings, a young woman named Liesel knelt over a chipped basin, washing soot from her face with melted snow. She was 23, too young for the world she had already endured, her body frail from hunger, her fingers trembling as she tried to scrub away the gray dust of defeat. Outside, the first American jeeps crept cautiously down Sonnenstrasse, their olive-green paint gleaming oddly bright against the ruined cityscape. All her life, Liesel had been told the Americans were monsters, men who would come to burn, enslave, and destroy. Yet now, as their engines rumbled through the wreckage of her homeland, she couldn't help but wonder what was real and what had been a lie. And before we go deeper into her story, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there as you step with me into this moment, when fear, propaganda, and humanity all collided in the heart of a broken city? But as she peered through the broken window frame, she saw a boy in uniform, no older than her brother who had died at Kursk, stop to hand a piece of chocolate to a barefoot child. Across Bavaria and Hessen, the same impossible scenes played out. Tanks parked beside bakeries without bread. Laughter echoing in streets where artillery had screamed only weeks before. Germany was a nation stripped bare, not just of armies and flags, but of certainty itself. The radios of the Reich were silent, their endless propaganda gone, leaving only rumor to fill the void. Whispers replaced orders now. The Americans are coming. They'll make us pay. But the first days of occupation brought something unexpected. Not cruelty, but questions. Not vengeance, but curiosity. Some soldiers asked only for directions. Others traded cigarettes for photographs of families that no longer existed. In the displaced persons camp outside Frankfurt, rows of women waited beneath a tattered Red Cross banner for bread. Their faces were sharp with hunger, their eyes glazed with disbelief. And among them stood a young U.S. corporal, smiling awkwardly as he handed out tins of corned beef. His name was Private James O'Donnell, 21, from Kansas. A farm boy who had never seen a building taller than a grain silo until Berlin rose before him like a scar. When he looked at the faces of the defeated, he didn't see enemies. He saw echoes of his sisters, of home, of people who had simply lost too much. Liesel was one of those who stepped forward that day, clutching her ration ticket like a confession. She dared not meet his eyes, but when he spoke, softly, slowly, without the tone of command, something inside her steadied. That spring, a strange quiet hung over the land. It wasn't peace yet, only the silence of people who had survived everything except hope. In small towns, German women emerged from cellars in patched dresses, faces pale and paper-thin. They watched the foreign soldiers, men who carried soap in one hand, rifles in the other, and tried to reconcile the contradiction. The Americans laughed, played harmonicas, offered gum to children. Their warmth felt almost indecent against the cold ruins around them. Orders forbade the soldiers from fraternizing. The Germans, too, were told to obey and keep their distance. But hunger and loneliness have a way of making rules fragile. One rainy evening in Dresden, as wind rattled the shattered glass of a window, an American knocked on Liesel's door. He wasn't searching for contraband or collaborators, only for a stove where he could heat his rations. She hesitated, remembering every warning, every poster that had painted men like him as monsters. But his eyes were tired, his uniform soaked through. She stepped aside. Inside, he poured her coffee from a dented tin, black, bitter, and astonishingly warm. She hadn't tasted coffee in 3 years. They sat across from each other, silent yet understanding. The language of exhaustion needs no translation. Outside, rain whispered against the broken panes. For a moment, she forgot who was conqueror and who was conquered. When he handed her a square of chocolate, she held it as if it were gold. Across Germany, similar moments unfolded. In Nuremberg, a woman traded bread for a smile. In Cologne, another hid a wounded GI who had fallen from his jeep. Compassion returned quietly, disguised as survival. But compassion carried risk. Neighbors whispered, officers warned. The ghost of the Reich lingered, hissing words like betrayal and shame. Could a heart trained for hate relearn tenderness? And for the Americans, could they forgive the faces of those they'd been ordered to destroy? Many were surprised to find not fanatical Nazis, but hollow-eyed mothers, frightened girls, and children who flinched at every sound. The letters home began to change. "They look like us," one GI wrote to his mother. "They just lost too much." By summer's end, flowers began to bloom through the rubble. Markets reopened between fallen walls. The laughter of children returned, faint but growing. The Americans, still forbidden from mingling, found excuses to stay. They helped rebuild roofs, handed out canned peaches, taught local kids to throw baseballs. Liesel found work at a small field kitchen, stirring thin soup for both German civilians and Allied patrols. James came often, trading his rations for stories he couldn't understand but wanted to hear. Their sentences stumbled, their gestures bridged the gaps. Once, she managed to ask, through broken words and motion, why he didn't hate her, why he wasn't angry for what her country had done. He only shrugged, then said quietly, "War's over." She didn't know the words, but she understood the feeling. For the first time, peace felt like more than surrender. As autumn crept in, rumors spread. American soldiers marrying German women. It sounded absurd, almost forbidden. Marry the enemy? Yet somewhere in Bavaria, a GI wrote home for permission to wed a girl from Frankfurt. Somewhere else, a young woman received a photograph of a man in uniform with 3 simple words scrawled on the back. Not enemy. Friend. Liesel clutched her ration card as another cold morning began. The ruins still smoked, but in the air there was a faint scent of bread. Across the camp, James raised a hand in quiet greeting before climbing into his jeep. A small gesture of warmth in a world learning, once again, how to live. She lifted her hand in return, a hesitant, almost fragile motion, one that felt heavier than any soldier's salute. It was 1945, and though Germany had crumbled to its knees, something unexplainable was quietly rising from its ashes. Not flags, not nations, but hearts. The faint pulse of humanity rediscovering itself among ruins. The war had ended in silence, but within that silence, 2 former enemies had begun to find their voices. What they didn't yet realize was that the words they were now learning, coffee, bread, home, would soon redefine what victory truly meant. In the weeks that followed, post-war Germany became a strange kind of contradiction. A land where ruin and tenderness stood shoulder to shoulder on the same cobblestone streets. American jeeps rolled through cities still breathing smoke, their engines echoing through empty squares as soldiers tossed chocolate to children who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. For women like Liesel, survival had long meant silence, to obey, to endure, to disappear. But now that silence was breaking apart, replaced by the hum of generators, the crackle of American radios, and the rhythm of swing music leaking through shattered windows. Each morning she worked in the field kitchen, stirring thin soup beside crates marked with white stars, while lines of men in khaki waited patiently, half soldiers, half boys who just wanted a taste of normal. Private James O'Donnell appeared every day, boots caked in mud and an easy grin that seemed untouched by bitterness. He always brought something small. A bar of soap one morning, a pair of worn gloves the next, once even a piece of chocolate carefully wrapped in paper. "For you," he'd say in clumsy German, gesturing for her to hide it quickly. Fraternization was forbidden by law, but kindness doesn't always listen to orders. Each act between them was an unspoken rebellion, a quiet crime of compassion. Washington's War Department had made it clear, no American soldier was to engage unnecessarily with Germans. But soldiers, as it turned out, were built from more than regulations. They were built from curiosity, from loneliness, from the aching desire to feel human again. To James, Liesel's cautious eyes became a kind of compass amid the moral fog of occupation. He had survived fire and rivers of blood, yet somehow, this quiet woman stirring soup in the wreckage unsettled him more than war ever did. Every word they exchanged could have cost them both. Still, he kept returning, sometimes to help her lift heavy kettles, other times just to hear her hum an old lullaby that soothed something raw inside him. Whispers spread fast through the camp. A German woman had been caught smiling too long at a patrolman. Another punished for accepting a gift of nylons. So Liesel kept her distance in public, but the fragile line between survival and longing grew thinner each day. One evening, as rain seeped through the kitchen roof, James helped her stretch a tarpaulin over the supplies. His sleeve brushed her hand. A small touch, but in a world drowned in ash, it felt like a spark. They stood there in the cold, their breath misting between them, until she whispered, "You should go." He nodded, yet neither of them moved. Across occupied Germany, quiet stories like theirs began to bloom in the cracks of despair. Cafes reopened under military supervision, but it was the soldiers who slipped extra sugar into the hands of German waitresses. The women called them Schokoladensoldaten, chocolate soldiers, half in jest, half in longing. The irony was unmistakable. Conquerors surrounded by abundance, the conquered defined by hunger. But their exchanges were never only about food or favors. They were about remembering what tenderness once felt like after years of brutality. Liesel's friend Marta, widowed and worn from the Eastern Front, warned her sternly. "They'll leave when the orders come," she said, "and you'll be left behind with shame and nothing else." Shame was a familiar companion, one that had lived in every German home since the surrender. Yet this time, Liesel felt something different stir beneath it, quiet defiance. When she met James again, she tried to tell him, through broken English and gestures, that she had once dreamed of America as a girl, the land of movies, of jazz, of freedom. He smiled, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a folded magazine page showing a woman holding a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Not all true," he said softly. "But the smiles, those are real." The days stretched longer. The Americans built new barracks. The Germans rebuilt their walls and their pride. At night, the sounds of Glenn Miller, Ella Fitzgerald, and Benny Goodman drifted from the recreation tents. That foreign rhythm seeped through the cold air, and sometimes the German women would listen from the shadows, swaying gently to a language they didn't understand, but somehow felt. One evening, James appeared by the kitchen carrying a small radio. He set it down, turned the dial until the static softened, and let the music fill the silence between them. She laughed. The first time he had ever heard her laugh, and for a heartbeat, even the ruins outside seemed beautiful. But beauty in war was always dangerous. An American lieutenant caught sight of them one afternoon and ordered James to report to headquarters. That night, Liesel sat by her window, staring down at the deserted street, wondering if mercy, too, had its limits. When James finally returned 2 days later, there was a quiet defiance in his eyes. "They warned me," he said simply. She looked at him. "You'll stop coming?" He shook his head. "No." That was the closest either of them came to a confession. By 1946, their secret was no longer rare. Across Germany, stories like theirs multiplied. The ban on fraternization was quietly dissolving under the weight of human reality. Commanders began to realize hearts could not be rationed. In Verdun, A soldier married the daughter of a former officer. In Hamburg, a nurse wed the GI she once nursed back from frostbite. American newspapers printed the headlines with curiosity and unease. Americans marrying German brides. Letters flooded in, some filled with outrage, others with unexpected warmth. One veteran wrote simply, "I didn't fight so we could choose who to hate. I fought so we could choose who to love." As for Liesl and James, they found small, secret ways to keep their connection alive. Between soup pots and whispered lessons, he taught her 3 words: coffee, home, tomorrow. She taught him words like freedom and peace, tracing each letter carefully into the dust that coated the counter. When he offered her a pair of army-issued nylons, she hesitated, Marta's warnings echoing in her mind. But this gift wasn't vanity. It was dignity. In a world stripped bare of softness, that small, delicate fabric felt like permission to feel human again. One evening, as the last of the snow melted into the soil, James told her quietly that he would soon be transferred to Bremen. The words shattered the silence between them like falling glass. She nodded, trying to seem unbothered, though her chest ached with something she couldn't name. "Maybe I write," he said, fumbling with a small notebook. She smiled faintly. "If letters can cross oceans," she replied softly, "perhaps hearts can too." Neither of them truly believed it, but both desperately wanted to. The night before he left, James came back to the kitchen one last time. The fires had long gone out, and the air smelled of rain and cooling ashes. He handed her a small, paper-wrapped parcel. Inside was a photograph of himself standing in front of a Kansas farmhouse, snow rising to his knees, his dog beside him. On the back, in his uneven handwriting, it read, "For when you forget that kindness exists." She stared at it for a long moment before reaching into her apron and pulling out a single pressed flower, the only thing she'd kept from the world before the war. Their fingers brushed as she gave it to him, and neither spoke. At dawn, the convoy rolled out. From her window, she watched the trucks fade into the mist, the photo pressed tight against her chest. Outside, Germany began to stir once more. People fetching water, carrying bread, gathering memory. The war had ended, but its aftershocks still rippled through every fragile act of connection. Somewhere down the road, James turned once to look back, though the ruins behind him were already swallowed by fog. That same spring, rumors began to spread. Stories of war brides, of women boarding ships and exchanging vows beneath foreign flags. For Liesl, such tales felt like distant dreams, too fragile to name, too impossible to hope for. Yet somewhere deep within her, she understood that once love awakens, it refuses to die quietly. The Americans had arrived as conquerors, but without intending to, they had ignited something far more dangerous, the rebuilding of hearts. By 1946, a year after the guns fell silent, the world was still learning what peace really meant. Germany's ruins no longer smoked, yet they whispered with memories that refused to fade. And within that fragile quiet, brown envelopes began to cross the Atlantic, letters carrying the faint scent of coffee, dust, and hope. Some were written by soldiers who couldn't forget the women they'd met among the wreckage. Others by women who dared to believe that kindness might survive war. Liesl wrote hers carefully, every word a risk. "The air is cold again here," she began, "but your photograph makes the winter smaller." Weeks later, the postman handed her a reply, and for one suspended heartbeat, it felt as though the war's vast distance had folded into something small, something human. James's letter was simple. He wrote that he was stationed in Bremen with a transport unit and that he thought often of her flour-dusted hands in the field kitchen, of her quiet voice humming while she stirred. "If there's a God in all this," he wrote, "he must have meant for us to meet." It was the kind of line that might have sounded naive in peacetime, but after 6 years of horror, sincerity itself had become an act of rebellion. Their letters passed through the army postal system, simple, tender messages that slipped through censors too weary to care about love. Then came the rumors, whispers that the United States might soon allow soldiers to marry foreign women. The idea seemed absurd, almost miraculous. But in December 1945, Congress passed the War Brides Act, granting permission for servicemen to bring their foreign wives home. A few months later, it was amended to include German and Japanese women, former enemies turned potential wives. In newspapers, it was a small bureaucratic note. But in occupied Germany, it was the sound of chains unlocking. For Liesl, it began with a question, written in trembling ink. "Would you come to America?" She read it under a weak lamp while snow pressed against the window. To leave meant safety, but also exile. To marry meant stepping into a life she could neither predict nor explain. She had lost her home, her family, her country's pride. But to be seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't call her enemy, that was worth any risk. When she finally wrote yes, she wasn't sure if it was love, faith, or surrender. The process that followed was cruel in its precision. Dozens of forms, interrogations, background checks. Every woman examined as though her heart were a weapon. Each bride-to-be had to prove she wasn't a Nazi, wasn't diseased, wasn't lying. American officers inspected them with the same dispassionate discipline they once reserved for rifles. And yet, beneath that cold machinery, humanity refused to die. James filed request after request, ignoring every smirk and scoff from his superiors. "You want to marry a German?" One captain laughed. "You sure you remember the last 4 years?" But James remembered them too well. Every burned village, every starving child. And maybe that's exactly why he needed something new to begin. By spring of 1947, ships began carrying German war brides across the ocean. The operation was ironically named Operation War Bride, as if love itself had to march under military orders. Liesl boarded one of those ships from Bremerhaven, clutching a small suitcase and James's photograph. Around her, hundreds of women prayed or wept softly, their voices swallowed by the hum of the sea. Some carried infants, children fathered by soldiers already waiting on the other side. Others carried nothing but fragile hope. As the ship pulled away, they watched the German coastline fade, a land of ghosts dissolving into mist. Days blurred together in gray and blue. The women shared stories in fractured English, their laughter too bright for a vessel filled with such heavy dreams. Liesl befriended a young woman named Hilda, who had married a mechanic from Ohio. One night, as waves slapped against the hull, Hilda whispered, "They say even poor people in America have refrigerators, and milk delivered in glass bottles. Can you imagine?" Liesl couldn't. She dreamed instead of Kansas. Wide golden fields, quiet skies without sirens, mornings that began with peace instead of fear. When the ship finally neared New York Harbor, the air itself seemed different, clean, electric, alive with promise. The women crowded the deck as the Statue of Liberty rose through the mist, her torch glimmering like a beacon of second chances. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. For some, their first glimpse of freedom. Liesl gripped the railing, tears slipping down her face. She had expected shame or fear. Instead, she felt wonder. On the docks below, rows of soldiers stood waiting, uniforms pressed, flowers in hand instead of rifles. Some were nervous. Others smiled like boys seeing sunlight after a long winter. And among them stood James, eyes searching the crowd, waiting for the face he'd carried through every mile of war. When James finally caught sight of Liesl, pale and weary from the long voyage, her coat fastened up to her throat, he froze in place. The clamor of the port seemed to vanish, leaving only the sight of her, walking slowly down the ramp, hands trembling, eyes searching. He stepped forward, uncertain of what to do or say, and simply extended his arm. She slipped hers through it gently. No words were needed. Silence said enough. That afternoon, they married in a small military chapel near the harbor, surrounded by a handful of other couples who had made the same improbable journey from ruin to hope. The chaplain, his voice worn from performing countless ceremonies that week, smiled faintly as he recited the vows. "You may kiss the bride," he said softly, almost as an afterthought. For Lizel, the moment didn't feel real. Not because of the kiss, but because, for the first time in years, there was no fear. Their first home was a small rented room above a bakery in Brooklyn. The city itself felt overwhelming. A blur of neon signs, underground trains roaring like thunder, and shop windows bursting with a kind of abundance she could hardly comprehend. The first time she saw a washing machine, she cried. Not from happiness, but from sheer exhaustion at the thought that even washing clothes could be this easy. The neighbors were polite, curious, and sometimes quietly judgmental. Some whispered behind curtains. Others brought casseroles with cautious smiles. The war still lingered in everyone's memory, but mercy, as it turned out, could be contagious. Letters from Germany told her not all endings were as kind. Some brides had been turned away, rejected by families who could not forgive. Others lived trapped between two worlds, seen as traitors to one country and reminders of guilt to another. Yet, for every tragedy, there were countless small miracles. Children with English lullabies and German middle names. Christmas trees shining in homes that once knew only blackout curtains. America, somehow, had absorbed its former enemies not through punishment, but through simple acts of kindness, through peanut butter and promise. One evening, while she baked bread in their narrow kitchen, James came home early, holding a letter from a friend still stationed overseas. "They're calling you girls war brides now," he said, smiling. She laughed softly. "It sounds like we fought a war just to marry." James looked at her, serious for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe you did." Later that night, as snow drifted quietly over the rooftops, they stood on the balcony together. Lizel asked in a whisper, "Do they still hate us?" He thought for a long moment, then said gently, "No, they're just surprised it ended this way." She rested her head on his shoulder, thinking of the ruins she left behind and of those who would never understand. And in that moment, she realized the greatest shock of all wasn't survival. It was forgiveness. The very nation that once dropped bombs over her home had now opened its doors to her. History demanded vengeance, but love, somehow, had chosen differently. Those ships hadn't just carried brides. They carried proof that mercy could travel farther than hate. Still, even as she slept that night, a faint unease lingered, that feeling of belonging and exile intertwined like threads of the same cloth. Tomorrow she would wake in America, in a world where the streets were whole and the people smiled easily. Yet a part of her would always remain standing at that harbor, halfway between the rubble and the dream, still waiting to see if kindness could truly outlast memory. By 1950, America had moved on from the war, but the war hadn't moved on from those who lived through it. The men returned to farms and factories, while the women who survived its ruins learned to silence the echoes of bombs by filling their lives with new recipes, new words, new dreams. Across quiet neighborhoods of the Midwest, behind white picket fences and gleaming Chevrolets, a quiet miracle was unfolding, German accents blending softly into American laughter. The newspapers no longer called them enemy wives. They were simply mothers, neighbors, citizens. Yet in kitchens like Lizel's, beneath the calm rhythm of ordinary life, the past still flickered, like an ember that refused to die. Their Brooklyn apartment had been replaced by a small house in Kansas, near James's family farm. The soil there was rich and forgiving, and the horizon stretched wider than she had ever imagined. It was a land without ruins, without sirens. A silence so deep it frightened her at first. The townspeople were kind, though uncertain. They smiled, sometimes too quickly. Children whispered when she spoke. Once, the grocer's wife remarked, "You speak good English," for one of them. Lizel smiled politely and thanked her, just as she had learned to do during the occupation. Peace, she realized, had its own set of survival rules. James worked long days hauling grain, and in the evenings, They sat on the porch watching fireflies float like tiny lanterns over the wheat fields. He rarely spoke of the war now. The nightmares had faded, replaced by the soft hum of domestic life. Her singing in the kitchen, the creak of the rocking chair, and the gentle cries of their newborn daughter, Emma. When Emma was born, the town's curiosity softened. Gifts arrived, blankets, casseroles, a tiny Bible. Forgiveness, it seemed, sometimes wore an apron. Still, not every door opened. At a veteran's supper one evening, an old man refused to shake her hand. "My brother died over there," he said, voice trembling with pain. Liesl wanted to tell him she'd lost her brother, too. That grief knew no language, no flag, but the words stuck in her throat. Later, James found her crying quietly in the kitchen. "He doesn't know you," he said softly. She nodded. "No," she whispered. "But he knows enough." Time carried them gently forward. Liesl learned to bake pies instead of strudel, to say howdy instead of hello. She learned that neighbors brought gifts when you were sick and gossip when you weren't. She learned that children asked without cruelty. One day, Emma came home from school holding a crayon drawing. 2 flags side by side, the stars and stripes on one, and a red cross on the other. "This one's yours," she said. Liesl laughed through her tears. Her daughter had drawn peace before the world had even finished arguing. Letters from Germany arrived less often now. Marta wrote once to say their town was rebuilding under American aid. "The soldiers give candy to the children," she wrote. "It feels like the end of the world was really just the beginning." Liesl read it aloud to James, who smiled faintly. "Guess we both got lucky," he said. "You got candy. I got you." In 1952, Liesl stood before a federal clerk and swore allegiance to the United States. Her voice trembled as she renounced her homeland. But when the words left her lips, she felt something she hadn't in years: belonging. Outside the courthouse, James took her hand and said, "You're one of us now." She looked up at him and whispered, "I always was." That night, they celebrated with roast chicken and apple pie, but she quietly added a small dish of boiled potatoes with parsley, a humble taste of home woven into her new life. Historians would later write that more than 14,000 German war brides became American citizens during those years. To the world, it was just a statistic. But to the women themselves, it was resurrection, the rebuilding of life, love, and identity. They created homes from contradictions, blending the nation that lost with the one that won, teaching their children that identity could be softer than politics and far kinder than memory. In Liesl's home, that harmony lived in every corner, a quiet testament to 2 worlds learning, at last, how to forgive. A cuckoo clock ticked softly above a faded portrait of James in his uniform. Beside it stood a Christmas tree dressed in paper stars, its base guarded by a small nativity carved long ago from German wood. When neighbors asked where she came from, Liesl would smile faintly and answer, "From before." It was the only place that still felt safe to claim. The years slipped by quietly. Emma grew into a freckled, wide-eyed girl, curious, bright. With her mother's steady gaze and her father's easy laugh, she asked the kind of questions that left silence hanging in the room. Was Grandpa a Nazi? Did you love Daddy even when you were enemies? Liesl told her the truth in pieces, the kind that children can hold without breaking. That people are often caught in storms they never started. And that love, when it finds you, doesn't ask which side you were on. On warm summer evenings, when the scent of wheat and rain drifted through the open windows, James would look at her and say, "You're the bravest woman I know." She'd smile and shake her head. "Not brave," she'd whisper, "just hungry." He always understood, not hunger for food, but for mercy, for something human after everything had burned. But history never truly ends. It only changes shape. In 1955, a small documentary crew came to Kansas to film veterans and their families. When they asked James if they could include he hesitated. Liesl teased him, Afraid they'll find out you married the enemy? He laughed softly. No, he said. I married the future. During the interview, the reporter turned to Liesl and asked what she thought of America now. She took a long pause, measuring each word carefully. It's strange, she said at last. I came here as the enemy, but everyone I've met has taught me that forgiveness is stronger than victory. The cameraman lowered his head, as if humbled by how gently truth could sound. Months later, when the program aired, neighbors began stopping her in the street. One old man, the same who once refused to shake her hand, appeared at her door with a jar of honey. My brother would have liked you, he said quietly. That night, Liesl cried again, but for the first time, her tears were sweet. Years later, she would look back and see the quiet pattern life had drawn. How mercy, like a hidden seed, had taken root in the ashes where war once burned. All across the country, thousands of women like her were doing the same. Planting gardens, baking bread, raising children who never learned to hate. The past hadn't vanished, but it had softened, folded gently into the rhythm of ordinary life. One golden autumn afternoon, after years filled with work and laughter, Liesl stood at the edge of her garden, watching Emma chase fireflies among the rows of late-blooming flowers. James sat nearby, older now, hands calloused yet steady, eyes full of quiet gratitude. The sky was painted in harvest gold, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the full weight and wonder of her journey. From rubble to porch light, from enemy to wife, from fear to family, the story of ruin had turned into one of redemption. She turned to him, eyes soft yet heavy with memory, and whispered, "It was all a kind of mercy, wasn't it?" He nodded, a faint smile touching his face. "The best kind," he said quietly, "the kind none of us ever truly deserved." The wind moved gently through the golden wheat, carrying with it the scent of earth, apples, and the promise of a calmer tomorrow. In the distance, a church bell rang, not for victory, not for surrender, but simply to honor the stillness of evening. As the echoes drifted away, Liesl closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not asking to forget the war, but to remember how it truly ended. For some, peace was written in ink, signed across maps and documents. But for others, it was written in smaller, softer gestures. A cup of coffee shared between once sworn enemies, a letter that crossed oceans instead of borders, a child born to two hearts that had once stood on opposite sides of history. The war had once taught humankind how to break, how to burn, how to destroy, but love, quiet, patient, and unarmed, taught it how to rebuild, one heart at a time. And to you, the listener, may your days be filled with that same kind of peace, the kind that asks for nothing in return, yet changes everything it touches. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where every tale reminds us that even after the darkest storms, there's always light waiting to be found.